The tragic history of the Warner Brothers family mansion, the Warner estate. It was night when the lights went out for the last time in that wing of the property. There was no announcement, no applause, only the distant sound of wind rustling through corridors that had once heard laughter, multi-million-dollar deals, promises of eternity. At some point in history, that place ceased to be merely a symbol of victory and began to carry a heavy, almost accusatory silence. Something there. It didn't end well. From the outside, the mansion still looked grand, imposing, untouchable. But inside, time had begun to collect its debt. The tragic history of the family. Mansion Warner Bros. It doesn't begin with decay. It begins with an absolute dream. A dream so big, it seemed impossible to fail. A dream built on creativity, ambition, and the conviction that success, once achieved, could last forever. And perhaps that's exactly where everything starts to go wrong. Imagine a place built to celebrate extraordinary achievements. A space designed not just as a residence, but as declaration of power. Every wall, every garden, every architectural detail told the world, we've reached the top. But the summit, as history insists on reminding us, is a lonely and unstable place. Some mansions are built to be lived in, others to be admired, and there are those that, over time, transform into silent witnesses to irreversible choices. This is one of those stories. Before we go back to the beginning, before the contracts, the cameras, the spotlights, and the money, allow me to ask you a simple but powerful question. If you could build any dream without limits, would you be prepared to pay the price it would demand throughout your life? If this question has sparked something in you, leave a comment about where you're watching from and what intrigues you most about stories of power and legacy. And if you're not yet part of this journey, consider subscribing. Stories like this aren't just about places. They're about human decisions that continue to resonate long after the doors close. Now, let's go back in time, because before the silence, there was enchantment. The Warner property wasn't built by visionary architects or heirs to ancient fortunes. It was erected by 4 Polish Jewish brothers who arrived in America with nothing but a stubborn certainty. Cinema would be the future. Harry, Albert, Sam, and Jack Warner. Sons of immigrants, raised in poverty, street vendors, film exhibitors in traveling circuses. They weren't born with a silver spoon in their mouths. They were hungry. And it was this hunger that led them to found Warner Brothers Pictures in 1923. When the studio began to prosper, especially after the groundbreaking release of The Jazz Singer in 1927, the first sound film in history, the Warner Brothers weren't content with simply dominating Hollywood. They wanted to prove to the world, and perhaps to themselves, that they had arrived, that they were no longer street vendors. They were kings, and kings need palaces. The Warner estate was acquired in the early 1930s, at the height of the studio's rise. Located in the Beverly Hills, the mansion stretched across more than 10 acres of perfectly planned land. It wasn't just a house, it was a statement. Spanish colonial architecture blended with Mediterranean influences, symmetrical gardens reminiscent of Versailles, fountains imported from Italy, ballrooms capable of accommodating hundreds of guests. Everything there was designed to impress, to dominate, to make any visitor feel they were entering not a residence, but an empire. The property's numbers were staggering: 23 bedrooms, 15 bathrooms, a private movie theater seating 80 people, a library with over 5,000 hand-bound volumes, an Olympic-sized swimming pool lined with Italian marble, tennis courts, stables, a separate guest house, larger than most residences in Los Angeles, and the detail that most impressed visitors. Each room in the mansion had an internal communication system, cutting-edge technology for the time, which allowed the Warners to control every aspect of the property without leaving their personal offices. But behind that visible grandeur, there was something deeper. The Warner mansion wasn't just about displaying wealth. It was about redemption, about proving that those boys who fled the pogroms in Poland, who slept in wooden shacks while selling used shoes, had won. Not just won. They had conquered the very essence of the American dream. And they did it through art, through film, through creating stories that billions of people would watch. The mansion became the social heart of Hollywood. Chaplin dined there. Bette Davis rehearsed lines in the gardens. Errol Flynn got drunk at legendary parties that lasted until dawn. American presidents were received in the main hall. The Warner estate was not just a movie house. It was cinema itself, materialized in stone, marble, and ambition. But while the world saw only the splendor, few perceived the machine that sustained that dream. Few asked how many hands were needed to maintain those perfect gardens. How many employees lived in the hidden outbuildings of the property, far from the eyes of the illustrious guests? How many dollars were spent monthly just to keep the lights on, the fountains running, the flowers fresh, the vineyards pruned? The Warner Mansion was a masterpiece, but like all masterpieces, it demanded constant sacrifice. And that sacrifice was only beginning to reveal itself. Because when a dream becomes too big, it ceases to be just yours. It begins to belong to the world. And the world exacts a high price for keeping dreams alive. The Warner estate was about to discover this in the most brutal way possible. But before that discovery happened, before reality exacted its price, there was a brief moment when everything seemed possible, when the mansion shone under the Californian sun like a fulfilled promise. And at that moment, no one imagined that that light would one day go out. Or worse, that it would remain lit, but illuminating something completely different from what its creators had dreamed. When you look at a mansion like the Warner estate in its heyday, what do you see? You see the marble halls, the Czech crystal chandeliers, the gardens that look like living paintings. But what you don't see, what no one is invited to see, is the human infrastructure that keeps this illusion of perfection running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. The Warner estate, in the 1930s and 1940s, permanently employed a staff of 53 people, 53 lives dedicated exclusively to ensuring that the mansion functioned like a Swiss watch. There were the gardeners, of course. 12 men who began their work at 5 in the morning, before the sun rose, so that the Warners never saw the maintenance process, only the final result. They pruned, watered, replanted, adjusted every leaf, every flower, every shrub. The estate's French garden demanded complex botanical knowledge. Each season required specific flowers, imported from different parts of the world. Orchids from Thailand, roses from Bulgaria, tulips from Holland. Everything needed to be perfectly synchronized so that the estate always seemed to be in eternal spring. Then came the household staff, 15 maids divided into shifts. They cleaned every inch of the mansion daily, 23 bedrooms, each with its own peculiarities, some with Persian rugs that couldn't be vacuumed, only brushed by hand, others with silk curtains that required specialized cleaning products. The maids weren't allowed to use the main elevators in the house. There were hidden service staircases, invisible corridors that crisscrossed the mansion like secret veins, allowing the staff to move around without ever being seen by the residents or guests. The kitchen at the Warner estate was run by a French chef who had worked in 3 Michelin-starred restaurants in Paris. He had a team of 8 assistants. They prepared meals for the family, of course, but they were also always ready for gala dinners with 100, 200 guests. There are records of parties at the Warner estate where more than 500 people were served in a single night. This meant planning menus weeks in advance, importing rare ingredients, coordinating cooking times with military precision. The chef had his own office within the kitchen, where he filed detailed files on the dietary preferences of each frequent visitor to the house. Who was allergic to seafood, who preferred red or white wine, who didn't eat meat on Fridays for religious reasons. There were also the drivers, 4 of them full-time, responsible for a fleet of 7 cars, including a Rolls-Royce Phantom, a Duesenberg, and an armored Lincoln Continental used when family members needed to travel with maximum security. The drivers didn't just drive. They were bodyguards, personal assistants, silent confidants. They knew secrets. They knew where Jack Warner went on the nights he told his wife he was working late. They knew who entered and left the property through the back gates, away from the eyes of photographers and journalists. And then there were the invisible ones among the invisible. The structural maintenance workers, plumbers, electricians, painters, carpenters. A mansion of that size is a living organism that constantly needs repairs. Clogged pipes, burnt wires, leaks that need to be dealt with before they become visible problems. These men lived in small houses at the back of the property, hidden by rows of trees. They had families, children who grew up playing on the outer boundaries of that property, always aware that there was an invisible line they couldn't cross. The front of the mansion, the beautiful side, wasn't for them. They belonged behind the scenes. But here's the truth no one likes to admit. Those 53 employees weren't just workers, they were the Warner estate. Without them, the mansion was just stone, wood, and glass. With them, it was magic. And yet none of them were ever photographed for the magazines that published articles about the house. None of them were mentioned in books about the history of Hollywood. They existed only as long as they were useful. And when the Warner estate began to face its crises decades later, when money started to get tight, when difficult decisions needed to be made, these workers were the first to disappear. Unceremoniously, without thanks, just numbers cut from a spreadsheet, because that's the cruel mathematics of grand estates. They need people to exist, but they treat those people as if they were as replaceable as carpets or curtains. And when you understand that, when you look at a historic mansion and see not only its beauty but the hundreds of anonymous lives that sustained it, you begin to realize that the true cost of luxury is never in the materials. It's in the people. It always has been. The Warner estate shone, but that shine was polished every morning by unseen hands. And as the years passed, as the world changed and the Warner fortunes began to face new challenges, those invisible hands began to disappear one by one. And with each disappearance, the mansion lost a little of its magic, until the moment came when the Warner estate had to decide, transform or die. But before that decision, there was a man who shaped that house not only with bricks and architectural plans, but with his own psychology. And understanding this man is understanding why the Warner Mansion became what it became, and why, in the end, it couldn't remain what it was. To understand the Warner estate, you need to understand Jack Warner, because that mansion wasn't just built by him. It was built from him, from his fears, from his ambitions, from his personal demons that he tried to exercise through marble, gold, and power. Jack Warner was born in 1892 in London, Ontario, Canada. He was the son of Polish-Jewish immigrants fleeing violent persecution in Eastern Europe. His father, Benjamin, was a shoemaker who barely managed to support his family. Jack grew up watching his parents work to exhaustion, seeing the despair in his mother's eyes when there wasn't enough food for all the children. That poverty left its mark, deep scars. The kind that never fully heal, no matter how many millions you accumulate later. When Jack and his brothers founded Warner Brothers, they weren't just building a studio. They were building a fortress against the world that had rejected them. And when Jack specifically decided to build the Warner estate, he wasn't just buying a big house. He was buying security. He was buying physical proof that he would never again be that hungry kid selling newspapers on the streets of Youngstown, Ohio. But here's the cruel paradox of men like Jack Warner. They can never truly escape who they were, no matter how high they build their walls. The Warner estate had 4-meter-high wrought-iron gates, 24-hour armed guards, state-of-the-art security systems. And yet Jack slept poorly. There are accounts of employees finding him pacing the mansion's corridors at 3 in the morning, unable to sleep, checking windows, locks, safes. He had recurring nightmares of losing everything, of waking up to find the mansion had been seized, the studio bankrupt, that he was back to square one. Jack Warner was known in Hollywood for two things: his creative genius and his personal cruelty. He produced some of the most iconic films in cinema history: Casablanca, Rebel Without a Cause, and My Fair Lady. He had an almost supernatural instinct for identifying talent and stories that would resonate with audiences. But this same man was capable of publicly humiliating actors and directors, firing loyal employees on petty whims, and severing ties with decades-long partners over insignificant disagreements. His relationship with his own brothers was complex and painful. Harry Warner, the eldest, was the conservative side of the company, the man of numbers, of prudence. Jack was the creative, impulsive side, willing to risk everything for a vision. The two constantly argued. Discussions that began in the Warner Brothers offices and continued at dinners on the Warner estate, in front of embarrassed guests. There was a permanent tension between them about who really ran the empire, and this tension poisoned the family for decades. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Jack Warner's psychology was his relationship with the mansion itself. He spent fortunes decorating and redecorating the same rooms. He hired the world's most famous designers, observed their work for weeks, and then, without warning, ordered everything to be torn down and started again. Because nothing was ever enough. Nothing ever perfectly captured the image he had in his head of what that house should represent. He wanted the Warner estate to say to the world, "This man has completely won." But inside him, the voice of the poor boy from Ontario whispered, "It's not enough. It will never be enough." This obsessive perfectionism extended to every aspect of the mansion. He fired 17 chefs in 10 years because none of them could make the brisket exactly like his mother did. He had the pool rebuilt 3 times because the shade of blue of the lining wasn't exactly what he had imagined. He would have fits of rage when flowers were placed in the wrong vases, when a rug was a few centimeters out of place, when a picture wasn't perfectly level. The estate staff learned to fear him. They developed complex systems to predict his moods, to become invisible when he was in a bad mood, to anticipate his demands before he needed to verbalize them. Working on the Warner estate paid well, very well, but the emotional cost was high. There are stories of maids crying in the service bathrooms after being reprimanded for tiny mistakes, of gardeners working until their hands bled because Jack had commented, in passing, that the rose bushes weren't properly pruned. And yet, despite all this harshness, there were moments when Jack Warner showed a surprising vulnerability, moments when he would sit alone in the mansion's private movie theater, watching old films he had produced in the studio's early decades, and cry. He cried for his brother Sam, who had died young before seeing the full success of Warner Brothers. He cried for his destroyed relationship with Harry. He cried, perhaps, for the boy he had been and whom he had spent his whole life trying to bury under layers of success and wealth. The Warner estate, at its core, was not a monument to triumph, but to a wound that Jack tried to heal by building something so grand, so impressive, that it would force the world to forget it. But wounds like that don't heal with marble, they only hide. And when external events began to put pressure on the estate, when economic crises and social changes forced impossible decisions, that wound reopened. And what emerged from it was no longer grandeur. It was fear. It was despair. It was the brutal realization that even the greatest of empires is merely a temporary illusion against time. Jack Warner would die in 1978, many years after losing complete control over the estate that bore his name. But before that, he would witness the beginning of the end, the moment when the dream began to crumble, and that moment arrived not with a dramatic collapse, but with something much more mundane, and therefore much more cruel. Taxes, legal changes, and the slow realization that the world no longer needed dynasties like his, at least not in the way they had existed until then. The collapse of large estates rarely happens all at once. There isn't a cinematic moment when the gates close and it all ends. Instead, there's a gradual erosion, a series of small defeats that accumulate until, one day, you look around and realize that what you once had no longer exists in the same way. For the Warner estate, this erosion began in the late 1950s and extended through the following decades, in successive waves of financial pressure, social change, and the transformation of the very nature of power in Hollywood. The first blow came from where it always does, for the very wealthy: taxes. In the 1940s, during and after World War II, the American government implemented wealth and inheritance taxes that reached 90% for the highest brackets. The intention was to finance the war effort and redistribute concentrated wealth. For families like the Warners, this meant that maintaining massive estates became increasingly unsustainable. Each year, a brutal percentage of the family's fortune was drained to the government. And this created constant pressure. Either you found ways to generate enough revenue to cover these taxes, or you started selling assets. To make matters worse, the film business itself was changing. Television arrived in the 1950s and destroyed the business model that had sustained the major studios. People stopped going to the movies as often. Numbers plummeted, and although Warner Brothers eventually adapted, producing content for TV, the transition years were financially brutal. Jack Warner, who had always invested heavily in expensive and risky productions, saw several projects fail, and each failure meant less money available not only for the studio, but to maintain the personal lifestyle he had built. The Warner estate in the 1960s began to show signs of neglect. It wasn't complete abandonment, but the perfectionist standards of the past were slipping. The staff of 53 employees was reduced to 30, then to 20. Gardens that were once replanted seasonally now remained the same year-round. Necessary renovations were postponed. The exterior paint of the mansion, which used to be redone every 2 years, began to peel. Small details that added together created a feeling that the property was aging faster than it should. Jack Warner, now in his 70s, fiercely resisted any suggestion of selling or downsizing the property. For him, that would be admitting defeat. It would be going back to square one. It would be confirming the fear that had haunted him since childhood, that everything he had built was temporary, fragile, an illusion about to dissolve. But economic reality was relentless. The mansion's maintenance costs exceeded $500,000 a year. Adjusted for today's inflation, that would be more than $5 million. And that doesn't include events, renovations, or structural emergencies. In 1967, Jack Warner did something he had sworn he would never do. He sold his controlling stake in Warner Brothers. He retained an honorary title and some creative influence, but real control of the studio passed into other hands. It was a devastating blow to his identity. He had always been Jack Warner, the movie mogul. Now he was just a rich man with an oversized mansion. And without the studio, the mansion itself lost some of its significance. It had been built as an extension of Warner Brothers. Power. How do you justify a property of that size when you no longer control the empire that sustained it? The 1970s brought a new wave of social changes that made properties like Warner increasingly anachronistic. The counterculture, the civil rights movements, the growing awareness of economic inequality, all of this created a climate in which flaunting extreme wealth was no longer viewed with admiration, but with discomfort or even hostility. The legendary parties at the Warner estate became rarer. Illustrious guests stopped appearing. The mansion, which for decades had been the social center of Hollywood, was becoming a relic of an era the world wanted to forget. Jack Warner died in 1978. His death marked the end of an era not only for him, but for the estate itself. Because with his death came the inevitable question, what to do with the mansion. His heirs had no interest in keeping it. They had grown up in a different world, had different values, and the idea of spending fortunes maintaining a gigantic property that served mainly to inflate the ego of a dead patriarch made no sense to them. They wanted to sell. They wanted to liquidate the assets and move on. But selling a property like that wasn't simple. Who would buy it? In the 1980s, the market for historic Hollywood mansions was down. Many were demolished, turned into condominiums, or subdivided into smaller lots. The Warner property faced the real risk of being dismembered, destroyed, erased from history. Its gardens could become parking lots. Its ballrooms could be transformed into corporate offices. The mansion that had housed Hollywood royalty could disappear under bulldozers and soulless real estate projects. It was in this moment of absolute crisis that an unexpected proposal emerged. A proposal that would save the Warner estate from destruction, but that would also transform it into something unrecognizable to Jack Warner. Because the solution to saving the mansion required it to cease being private. It required it to open itself up. It required it to become public. And for a man like Jack, who had built that property specifically as a private sanctuary, as a fortress against the world, this transformation would have seemed like a betrayal. But he was no longer alive to prevent it, and the mansion to survive needed to adapt. It needed to change its purpose. It needed to accept that its future would not be like its past. And this acceptance, although necessary, came at a cost that not everyone could clearly see at the time. The solution to saving the Warner property came from an unexpected direction. Non-profit organizations dedicated to historic preservation. In the early 1980s, groups like the National Trust for Historic Preservation and local Los Angeles conservation organizations began to realize they were losing irreplaceable pieces of Hollywood history. Mansions that had witnessed the birth of the film industry were being demolished to make way for commercial developments. And with each demolition, a piece of American cultural memory disappeared forever. The Warner property was identified as a priority case, not only for its impressive architecture or its history tied to Warner Brothers, but because it represented something greater, the American dream materialized in stone and gardens, the story of immigrants who became kings of the industry. If that mansion were lost, it wouldn't just be a building that disappeared, but a symbol. And symbols, when properly preserved, have a value that transcends any immediate monetary value. The proposal was to transform the Warner property into a museum and space for cultural events. The mansion would be restored to its original splendor, but it would no longer be a private residence. It would be open to the public for guided tours, rented for filming, luxury weddings, corporate and charitable events. The revenue generated by these activities would finance the property's upkeep, and crucially, the history of the Warner family would be preserved and told to future generations not through forgotten books on shelves, but through the physical experience of walking the same corridors that Jack Warner walked, of seeing the same gardens that celebrities of Hollywood's golden age admired. Jack Warner's heirs accepted the proposal, not because they loved the idea of strangers invading their father's private sanctuary, but because it was the only viable alternative to complete destruction. And so, in 1985, the Warner estate was officially transferred to a historic preservation trust. It then began a meticulous restoration process that would take years and cost millions of dollars. Architects specializing in historical restoration were hired. They worked with old photographs, interviews with former employees, construction records, everything to ensure that every detail was restored with historical accuracy. Gardens were replanted following the original landscape designs. Furniture that had been sold over the years was tracked down and, where possible, repurchased. In cases where this was not feasible, exact replicas were commissioned. The goal was for a visitor to the Warner estate to have an authentic experience of what that mansion was like in its heyday. in the 1940s. But here's the philosophical question no one wanted to confront directly. When you turn a private residence into a museum, what exactly are you preserving? You are preserving the physical mansion, yes, the materials, the architecture, the objects, but you are forever losing something intangible and equally important, the life that happened there. The Warner Estate as a museum is visually identical to the Warner Estate as the Warner family home, but spiritually, emotionally, they are completely different places. One is a carefully constructed stage. The other was a living organism with all its imperfections, tensions, moments of genuine joy and real despair. The first guided tours began in 1987. Groups of 30 people, accompanied by trained guides who recited historical facts with academic precision. Visitors walked through the ballrooms where Humphrey Bogart had danced, through the gardens where the scripts for Casablanca were discussed, through the private cinema room where Jack Warner watched the first cuts of his most famous films. And the visitors were impressed. They took photographs, they bought souvenirs in the gift shop located in what was formerly the guest house. They left emotional comments in the guest books about how magical, historic, and unforgettable that place was. But what they couldn't feel, what no restoration can recreate, was the fear of Jack Warner walking alone through those corridors at 3 in the morning, the tears of the maids in the service bathrooms, the violent arguments between the Warner brothers that echoed off the walls, the loneliness of a man who built a palace to prove he was no longer poor, but who never truly believed it. These truths cannot be contained in informational plaques or 90-minute guided tours. The Warner property as a public space has become extremely lucrative. Today, it is one of the most sought-after locations in Los Angeles for luxury weddings. Couples pay six-figure sums to get married in the same gardens where Hollywood stars celebrated decades ago. Technology companies rent the space for product launch events. Film production companies use the mansion as a location for period films. Annual revenue easily exceeds $3 million, more than enough to cover maintenance costs and still generate funds for historical preservation projects at other properties. In practical terms, the transformation was an absolute success. The Warner property was saved. It not only survived, but thrives. Thousands of people visit the site every year, learn about the history of American cinema, and are inspired by the Warner Brothers journey. Film students conduct research in the archives kept on site. The mansion has become a valuable educational resource and an important cultural landmark. But there is a cost to this transformation that is rarely discussed. When a place becomes public, it needs to conform to public expectations. It needs to be sanitized, made safe, made palatable to diverse audiences. The story told on tours is the official, polished, acceptable version. Much is said about Jack Warner's creative genius, about the groundbreaking films he produced, about the glamour of Hollywood's golden age. Much less is said about his cruelty, about the employees he humiliated, about the family feuds that destroyed relationships, about the psychological cost that mansion represented for everyone who lived or worked there. And perhaps that's inevitable. Perhaps historical preservation always involves a certain degree of myth-making. Because if we told the whole truth, all the complexity, all the pain mixed with beauty, would people still want to visit? Would they still pay to get married there? Would they still see that place as magical? Or would they begin to realize that every grand mansion is, at its core, a monument to inequality, to unbridled ego, to the desperate attempt of some individuals to prove themselves superior to the rest of humanity? Today, when you visit the Warner Estate, you see perfection, impeccable gardens, gleaming halls, a coherent and inspiring narrative about the American dream and success through hard work. And that's not a lie, but it's not the whole truth either. The complete truth includes the invisible hands that built and maintained that dream. It includes the psychological price Jack Warner paid for his obsession. It includes the irony that the only way to preserve his private fortress was to destroy his privacy forever. Because in the end, the Warner property no longer belongs to the Warners. It doesn't belong to any family. It belongs to history. And history has its own demands. It preserves what it considers important and lets the rest fade into obscurity. It transforms complex people into simple characters. It transforms homes into museums. And in the process, something essential is lost. Not something tangible, but something real nonetheless. There are former Warner Brothers employees still alive. Some of them visited the site after it was transformed into a museum, and when journalists ask them how they feel about seeing the preserved mansion, their answers are curiously ambiguous. They say it's beautiful. They say it's important that the place was saved, but they also say, almost always with a sad smile, that it's not the same house anymore, that something has been lost. When pressed to explain what, they have difficulty articulating. Because how do you explain that a place can be physically identical but spiritually empty? How do you explain that preservation and death are sometimes just two sides of the same coin? The Warner estate exists today as a compromise between total destruction and impossible preservation. It's the best solution we could find for a problem that has no perfect solution. Because the truth is, you can't truly preserve the past. You can only create stylized versions of it. Versions that serve the purposes of the present. And the current purpose of the Warner estate is to educate, inspire, generate revenue for historical preservation, and serve as a setting for luxury events. These are valid purposes, important ones even. But they are very different purposes from those Jack Warner had in mind when he built that mansion. If he could see his property today, how would he feel? Pride that it survived? Anger that strangers freely walk the corridors that were his sanctuary? Relief that his legacy is being preserved? Or that deep sadness that comes from realizing that everything we build, no matter how grand, eventually slips out of our control and transforms into something we didn't plan for, didn't want, didn't recognize? Perhaps all these emotions at once. Because that's the nature of legacy. It never truly belongs to the one who creates it. It belongs to the future, and the future does with it what it needs to do, without asking permission, without guaranteeing that the story will be told exactly as you would like, just ensuring that something survives, even if that something is only a shadow, an approximation, an echo of what truly was. The Warner estate is still there, in Beverly Hills, perfectly preserved. Open to the public Tuesday through Sunday, by reservation and with an entrance fee. If you visit, you'll see one of the most impressive mansions in Hollywood history. You'll see gardens that seem straight out of a dream. You'll see halls that witnessed crucial moments in American culture. And if you're lucky, you might even be able to imagine, for a brief moment, what it was like to live in that place, when it still pulsed with real life, with real tensions, with real dreams and fears. But here's the question I leave you with. Is it worth it? Is it worth transforming homes into museums, lives into narratives, complexity into simplicity, just to preserve the illusion that we can keep the past alive? Or is there a point at which we should simply let things die? Accept that everything is temporary, that all greatness eventually dissolves, and that perhaps this is not a tragedy, but simply the nature of things. I don't have a definitive answer to that question. But I know that every time we visit a historic mansion, every time we walk through gardens that have been kept artificially perfect, every time we admire architecture that only exists because millions of dollars are spent annually to prevent its natural deterioration, we should ask ourselves, what are we really preserving? And more importantly, what are we losing in the process? The Warner property is a triumph of historical preservation. But it's also a reminder that all preservation is, at its core, a form of death. A controlled, careful, well-intentioned form, but death nonetheless, because when you freeze something in time, when you prevent it from changing, growing, adapting organically, you also prevent it from truly living, And perhaps this is the last lesson that the Warner Mansion has to teach us, that all great beauty demands sacrifice, not only from those who build it, not only from those who maintain it, but also from those who preserve it, the sacrifice of accepting that the preserved version will never be as true as the living version, that museums, however meticulous they may be, are always just ghosts of what was once real. Now tell me, after learning this story, what's your opinion on preserving historical heritage? Should we save these mansions by turning them into museums, or let them follow the natural course of time? And what other historical mansion or palace would you like me to investigate in depth? Leave your answer in the comments. Your suggestion could be the next video on the channel, because every great property has a story. And every story, when you dig deep enough, reveals truths that go far beyond architecture and decoration. They reveal what it means to be human, what it means to dream, what it means to try to leave a permanent mark in a world where nothing is permanent. And these truths, these are the ones that deserve to be preserved, not in museums, but in memories, in reflections, in conversations like the one we are having now. The Warner estate exists, but the real Warner Mansion, the one Jack built with his hopes and fears, the one that housed real life and not just guided tours, that mansion disappeared the moment it transformed into something else. And perhaps that's okay. Perhaps that's how it should be. Perhaps the mistake isn't turning mansions into museums. Perhaps the mistake is believing that museums can capture life. They capture objects, they capture facts, they capture dates and names. But life escapes. It always has. It always will. And when you understand this, when you truly internalize this truth, you begin to look at places like the Warner property differently, not with less admiration, but with an admiration tempered by the melancholy of knowing that what you are seeing is simultaneously real and false, preserved and lost, there and absent, a physical paradox that exists in space but not in time, a message from a past that no longer exists, written in a language we are forgetting how to read. This is the true story of the Warner property, not the story on the plaques, but the story in the silence between the words, in the shadow behind the light, in the invisible cost of visible luxury. And if you've made it this far, if you've read or listened to this story to the end, then you've understood something most people will never understand about these places, that they're not about wealth, they're about mortality, about humanity's desperate and doomed attempt from the start to build something so grand that it outlives us, that makes us immortal through stone and marble and perfectly manicured gardens. But we are not immortal, and neither are our mansions. Even when they still stand, even when they are preserved with museum-quality perfection, they have already died. Because places are not made of materials, they are made of moments. And moments cannot be preserved, only remembered. And even memories eventually fade. The Warner estate remains, but the real Warner Mansion, that exists only in stories like this, in imperfect attempts to capture in words something that has always been greater than words. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps it's the best we can do, to tell the stories, all of them, the beautiful ones and the ugly ones, the official ones and the whispered ones, and to let each person who hears them decide for themselves what they mean. Because in the end, every grand mansion asks the same question: what are you willing to sacrifice for beauty, for grandeur, for legacy? And the Warner estate, with its history of glory and collapse, of preservation and loss, of dreams realized and prices paid, answers that question in the only way that matters, with the truth, complex, contradictory, uncomfortable, but true nonetheless. It's true. Unlike mansions, it doesn't need to be preserved. It just needs to be told.